Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Finance and Audit Standing Committee for Tuesday, July 11th. As always, we are meeting on the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. Welcome, everyone. May I have a motion for the adoption of the agenda? Moved by Peter, seconded by Ted. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. We have committee minutes to approve from the May 8th Finance and Audit Standing Committee. Moved by Patty, seconded by Ted. Any changes, errors that people notice? All right, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Any business arising from the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move on to our one and only, but very exciting agenda item for today. Today we're having a presentation on living wage, and this is an initiative that is gaining momentum through the province of British Columbia, and certainly a discussion about living wage, what it is, the certification process, how communities and organizations have approached the living wage conversation is important, and it dovetails really well into conversations that the council's already been having about affordable housing. And also in communities that have made a transition from heavily resource-based sector employers to more services, medium and small businesses. A discussion about living wage matters because it's about making sure that the citizens of our community can continue to be also economic drivers and participate in life in Squamish, afford to live here, afford to shop here, afford to be, active members of our community. So I'm really excited today that we're starting this conversation in Squamish. Our goal here is not necessarily to make any big decisions, but it's to learn, and we have two people here to help us do that. So I'd like to introduce Deanna Ogle, who's the campaign manager for the Living Wage for Families campaign, as well as Ludgate, who is from Vancity. She's the manager of community investment. So welcome to you both. And we are joined in the audience by many of our staff and also members of the community. And at committee, we do encourage questions from the community, and so because we are live streaming this, if you have a question after the presentation, raise your hand. We'll invite you up to the table and make sure that people can be part of this conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to the two of you.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here and for beginning this conversation. I hope it kind of continues and is part of a broader dialogue around what the living wage is and the beginning of kind of some thinking on that issue. So I'll just start my presentation, and I usually start my presentation with a photo of my family. So this is me as a young child. So I'm the young girl in the corner with the long hair and the hair pieces. And because I think that when we talk about the living wage, what we really are talking about is families. And so I think it's always nice to kind of ground it in that. 1 out of every 3 poor children in BC lives in a family where one parent works full-time full year. And although I didn't grow up in BC, I did grow up in a family where both my parents worked more than full-time hours in order to make ends meet. But that shifted for my family a few years after this photo was taken. And what shifted is that my mother got a job as a support worker at a local hospital, and this was a job that paid a living wage. So as a young child, I didn't quite understand the context of what that meant for her or for my family. But what I did understand is that we went out for supper. So as a family of 5 kids in a small rural community, you don't go out for supper a lot. And not only did we go out for supper, but my mother sat us down and we had our menus, and she said, order anything you want. Now, as a young child growing up in a low-income family, you don't often get a broad choice from a menu. You're kind of directed, here's your choices, and choose from that. And I remember very distinctly looking at my siblings, and we gave each other that expression that children give when an adult has told them something unusual. So kind of, is she for real? Are we going to do this? And so I did what children do when given resources and opportunities. I ordered ribs. And my family remembers, my siblings remember what it is that we ordered that day. And for my parents, it meant a lot less stress. It meant that they could have some breathing room at the end of the month for unexpected costs or things that came up in our family. And so that's something that we think about when we're thinking about the living wage. Not just, what does it take to get folks above the poverty line, but how do we allow folks to participate in the community, and what does participation look like? So just a quick run through of what the poverty context is in BC. BC is the only province in Canada that doesn't have a poverty reduction plan. There is a commitment on the part of our new provincial government to shift that, and we look forward to seeing how that develops. A majority of poor children in BC live in families with some paid income. So 1 in 3 live with at least one adult who works full-time, full year. Half live with an adult who has some contact with the paid workforce, whether that's part-time or seasonal work. Squamish has a child poverty rate of 14.9%. So what that looks like is there's 650 children living in poverty in our community. So that's lower than the provincial average, but there are numbers there, and there is an opportunity to take a stand on that issue. And then I think this one is a stat that I always feel a bit embarrassed to name when I'm working with families who are in poverty, and that is that families do better when their income increases. That when they have more income, they're more able to take care of their kids. They're more able to build in some resiliency into their parenting, but also into their children. So of the 27 factors identified as having an impact on child development, 80% improve with family income. So family income is a big indicator of wellness. And not only is it a big indicator of wellness for individuals, it's also an indicator of wellness for our community. So when we have low wages, we see an increase in some of the negative impacts of our communities. Do we see a higher inequality? We see increased negative health outcomes. Stress is hard on our bodies. We see that kids are struggling in school. They're challenged with outcomes. But I think when we're looking at a municipality and we're looking at some of what creates a community, I think it's also really important to talk about how poverty impacts participation in our communities. So we know that the living wage is, for Metro Vancouver, $20.62 an hour. We know that the minimum wage is $10.85 an hour. So we can't negotiate with our landowner when we only get 3 of the 4 expected shifts a week. So often we negotiate with the variable that we do have, and that's our time. And so that means that people are working multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. That means that they're not volunteering with their children's soccer team. It means they're not able to participate in the committees that we form in order to enrich our communities. So we lose out on that voice, and I think there is a collective impact for that. So what is a living wage? So now we know some of the impacts. What are some of the solutions? So looking at a living wage, it's a bare bones calculation. We look at what is the rent, groceries, items like extended health care, social participation. Importantly, we also include 2 weeks savings for each adult for those times when your child has a cold and your childcare won't take your kid and you've got to take that day off work. It doesn't include debt repayment or savings for future plans like children's education or home ownership. It is a bare bones calculation. From an employer perspective, paying a living wage is a combination of salary and non-mandatory benefits equal to a living wage. So we include non-mandatory benefits like MSP, extended health care, or sick leave, paid sick leave. And that can add up to quite a bit. And that's on the premise that if my employer pays my MSP, I don't need to have the savings myself in order to pay that. That's part of an overall wage package. We do have an online calculator for employers to calculate the value of their benefits on our website. I would encourage folks to visit that if they're curious about how their wage stacks up against that. But generally, a benefits package similar to the one that you might have at a municipality, you're looking at about $3, $3.50 an hour. So it can be substantial in terms of the benefits that we offer families. There isn't a calculation for Squamish at this point. We don't have an understanding of what the living wage would be in this particular community. Typically, calculating a living wage for a community takes about 4 to 8 hours of time, depending on the person's familiarity with Excel, as well as the kind of availability of childcare costs in your community. Sometimes it's easier to dig those numbers up. So that's some of the capacity that would need to be addressed in order to figure out what the living wage would be in your particular community. I did a quick little scan before coming in, and it would be lower than the Metro Vancouver rate. Your housing charges are quite a bit lower than Metro Vancouver. But sometimes in smaller communities, childcare becomes more expensive because of its limited availability. So how do we do that? What does that mean? The first step in looking at a living wage is to start asking questions, is to exactly have these conversations. We want to figure out how many staff would see an increase in wages due to a living wage policy. Where is the opportunity for positive impact? What is the context of the vendors that you work with? So what is the procurement context of your community? These questions can be answered in a staff report. So importantly, a staff report or requesting a staff report allows you to kind of come up with these answers and have a concrete discussion with a real understanding of what some of the challenges might be and what some of the opportunities are. So it provides that opportunity. And I would encourage you to be thoughtful and not rush through the thinking process. So the living wage, and Catherine will talk a little bit more about it, is more of a journey, an ongoing process. And so having that thinking at the front end is worthwhile in terms of getting a policy that's meaningful and has impact. Especially with municipalities that might have more limited capacity. So Pitt Meadows, I think they took, I think, a year to kind of move through that kind of thinking process. And so I'd encourage you to kind of do that in a timeline that works both for you and for staff. The next step is that developing a plan. So you've done the thinking, and now it's time to kind of come up with a plan. And a clear implementation plan is necessary for becoming a living wage employer. So you need to kind of understand who are the key players that need to be at the table, and any plan has to include an internal communication strategy. So how do we talk about this within our staff, within our municipality, as well as an external communication strategy? How do we talk about this with our community? And then also think about how this can be integrated into other goals that you have as a municipality. So for example, Quesnel integrated the living wage into their local purchasing strategy. So they were doing a couple things that involved looking at procurement at the same time, and they just integrated the living wage into that so that it wasn't it's kind of a standalone project, but it was part of that overall goals that they had as a municipality. And I think looking at that integration helps with some of the capacity questions that might come up with a smaller municipality. And I think Quesnel might be a good municipality to actually have some conversations with about the living wage and some of the opportunities that they saw there. But also some of the challenges, because they are a community outside of Metro Vancouver. So some of our other municipalities are in Metro Vancouver, and so there's shared costs that come with kind of just being urban and being surrounded by other municipalities that you may not have here. And of course there are differences, but there might be more commonalities than you would think. We have a stepped implementation process, so we encourage folks to kind of move through these steps in a way that's meaningful and has impact for you, but we don't want you to rush through. So the first step is to develop your implementation plan and timeline. The next step is to really see what you're doing with your direct staff, and then start on your procurement processes. So the procurement process is often where the heavy lifting of the living wage takes place, and so thinking about that as probably the process that you'll be engaged in the longest. And then once you're a living wage employer is when you have a process in place for living wage procurement. So any month-to-month contracts have been renegotiated up to living wage. You have a timeline of contracts as they expire that you're going to insert living wage language into. And then you also have a process in place for annual assessment of staff, direct staff, and making sure that as the living wage shifts, you're moving it up. So once you do that, that's when the hard work of planning becomes real change in your community. And importantly, when there's an opportunity as a municipality to bring your leadership to the table on the issue of the living wage, that what we see with municipalities isn't necessarily a dramatic change in the community. Often staff are already making almost all staff are often already making a living wage, but what it is an opportunity within procurement, especially partnered with a local purchasing strategy to have a real impact in your community and in your town. But there's also an opportunity to invite other companies, other organizations that you work with as a municipality to also become living wage employers. And we've seen that in Quesnel. We've seen a security company become a living wage employer as a result of that change. With the City of Vancouver, of course, all their staff are already paid the living wage. What we've seen is that they've been able to use that influence to bring in a number of other living wage employers, but also to highlight that working poverty as an issue in the community that needs to be talked about. So there is a leadership opportunity there. It's also a journey. It's not a finish it and move on to the next kind of goal. That becoming a living wage employer is a multi-year commitment. It's something that will be integrated into your planning processes moving forward. And so there's an opportunity to really step up to that leadership, as I was mentioning. And I think to see yourself as a leader in the community on the issue of working poverty, and also invest in your local economy in a meaningful way. And that's it, so thank you. So,
Yeah, so Catherine, do you have a presentation as well? Okay, so I'll just do some questions now that Deanna's finished, and then we'll chat.
Thank you. I had two questions. One was with respect to the 14.9% of children in Squamish live in poverty, 650 children. How do you define that, or what is the criteria for that number?
Yeah, so what I was looking at, where I got that number from is the 2014, is Stats Canada from 2014, so it's from the most recent Child Poverty Report Card put out by First Call, the BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition. And so they're looking at municipalities, so within the municipality, they're using their stats, the Stats Canada information comes out of census districts.
But is that based on the parents' income, or?
It's based on parents' income. So it's based on parents' income, and the poverty line, if that's we're using, is an after-tax low-income measure. So that's the most common. Canada unfortunately doesn't have a definition of poverty. So there's a couple measures that folks use, but that's the most common measure that you'll see used as a comparator across Canada.
Is there a number associated with that? Is there, what would that income level be?
So the income level is for a family of two with two parents with two children, so a similar model to the methodology that we use for calculating the living wage. It's about $35,000 a year.
Total family income.
Total family income.
I had another one on a different subject, but. Okay. The procurement policy you talk about, is that, for example, a municipality like Quesnel or ourselves, does that mean we don't buy from companies that don't pay a living wage?
It means that you support companies to pay a living wage. So it's not necessarily, what we found is as municipalities move to be living wage employers, that often the vendors are really excited to have the opportunity to pay their staff better. So it's, there is a premium that's put on the cost of service contracts. So work that's done on city property, including construction work, so on streets if it's construction. And so there's some areas that it might cost a bit more for some of that contracting, but that cost is passed not to the vendor but to the worker. So, so for example, a cleaning contract might cost a bit more because generally, and I don't know what the sector wage for cleaners is here in Metro Vancouver. The sector wage for cleaners is generally, office cleaners is about $13 an hour. And so that person then gets an increase to the living wage, if that, so a combination of benefits. And so the vendors usually actually really excited to be able to pay their workers more. They see a number of benefits as a result. They often see a higher engagement of that worker. The person sticks around more, so they've reduced their training costs.
Thanks. Is this basically just for the municipality, so our workers within the municipality and the government, and so the things we actually have control over?
Yeah.
So it'd be basically just stating that we are a living wage and ensuring that all our employees. And you know, our public perception of our municipalities, and I think of most governments, is that we overpay our workers.
Yes.
And that we overpay our contractors and that our contracts are bloated. And, you know, that is the perception, and it may not be the reality. I think doing the analysis is definitely something that's valuable, but I wonder how much influence we get, you know, our community, seeing our wages go up in the municipality but not in the community, for me would be a big problem. You know, we overtax our, well, in my personal opinion, and I know it's not Doug's personal opinion, but overtaxing small businesses and constantly increasing the amount that small business has to pay out to the municipality to foreign services means that they can't pay their employees as much as they would, or they have to let employees go. So our actions in economic development affect the living wages in our community. And to move to living wages in our municipality when we pay a lot of wages to our workers, I'm wondering what how we would deal with public perception.
Yeah, so one is to kind of frame it as reinvesting in your community and reinvesting in the economic development of your community. So, and investing in people's ability to participate in the community. So I think part of it, and I think that's maybe why I would suggest looking at the Quinnell model, so pairing it with a local purchasing strategy so that you can concretely say, yeah, we're trying to invest in our small businesses, because typically procurement contracts get bundled in a way that becomes hard for smaller businesses to bid on that. So thinking about your procurement strategy and how the two goals can be combined, and I think that might help a bit with some of the public perception. The other is to say, you know, as we move from a resource-based community to one that's relying on tourism and the service sector, how can we ensure that that folks are moving in a way that allows them to actually take advantage of some of the services, like go out for supper, or, you know, do some of these opportunities. And I think that's part of a communication strategy. So thinking about not just your internal communications, but external. But what we've seen with the living wage is, you know, there's always a couple folks who have a negative opinion, but for the most part, it's been really actually positive that most folks are actually really excited to see their municipality take this step, are really proud of their municipality for taking this step. They see folks struggling, whether that's themselves or their community or their children. Often actually the biggest support we get is from folks who have their adult children living with them, who are working in the service sector and struggling.
Thank you.
So I've got Linda, Patty, Ted, and then I'm going to go to Catherine for her presentation.
Thank you, Chair. I'm concerned that perhaps the answer here was not entirely clear, because what I heard the question was, is this just our municipal staff? And I understand from the presentation that it's not to be certified, it's also with who we contract with.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that was clear. But maybe it was just me.
Thank you.
Yeah, Linda and I actually, when we first started talking about living wage a couple months ago, looked at our pay schedule throughout the various disciplines within the municipality, and we're actually kind of 95% there. There's only 2, I think, within the collective bargaining agreement that are currently, and it's very specific to like skate patrol, kids that jobs that are usually for teenagers, typically. And I suspect if we actually did the analysis through our procurement, we're probably pretty close. Most municipalities that I've done research are, it doesn't massively impact budgets to actually get to living wage, because as Councillor Chappelle says, we generally in government pay a fair wage. So I think, I don't want to get alarmist yet, because I think the impact may be, it does speak to union issues and collective bargaining, and that's cool. So I guess a quick question about how, when you have a job like typically for a 16-year-old after school doing skate patrol, how does living wage sort of differentiate at all between that type of thing?
So,
Or if it does, or if it
so
doesn't.
with our policy, so one of our policies, we do exempt student positions, but from the living wage. So, but they have to be student positions. So that means that because we differentiate between something that's explicitly for students as a learning opportunity versus a job that may happen to be held by students because maybe it's casual or low wage, and so folks who have bigger concerns aren't able to take it. So if it's a student position, which is seasonal in nature, requires that the person be going back to school or be attending school. I know with the Fraser Valley Library that their shelver position, for example, one of the requirements is the person is attending school. So that we would see that as a student position versus in Port Coquitlam they had a position called a recreation assistant, which is very casual, and it happens to be held by a number of students simply because it is so casual. And so those positions we did require that they pay a living wage. Is that helpful?
And to be honest, I'm not sure it really matters.
Yeah.
In terms of the grant, like it's not massive budget implication anyway, and
Yeah.
it may be that you just want to simply be the leader and make a statement regardless or not. So I just wanted to maybe clarify that, but I just so that council doesn't get a little bit alarmist, this is a very small portion of who we currently employ.
Yeah, I think it more impacts a lot of the nonprofits that we have certified as living wage employers because they do often have Service Canada grants for summer positions, and those grants are often only at a minimum wage rate, and so it's limited.
Thank you.
Ted, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, I feel kind of the same way as Sue about we start putting pressure on business to pay minimum wage and we lose jobs. And I can understand this, I'd like to review the Quinnell one and see what the policies didn't pan out for the community. But, there's a real problem out there with people that are not related to us that have not living wage. If this worked, if we went to this work and adopted it for the district, we're adopting it for the district. We're not adopting it for the 3,000 people in the community that are making $12 an hour.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I guess it'll have a benefit. But
Yeah, certainly in listening to the Mayor of Quinnell speak, they are trying to have the highest density of living wage certified employers to make sure that economic participation happens in their community, and they're doing that through their local procurement. So it's not about pressuring businesses. I think it's about really taking up a leadership position and encouraging and making the information available. And so yeah, I wouldn't want us to feel like this conversation is happening because we will put pressure on organizations to follow.
It's providing the opportunity for businesses that may want to get there and who are engaged in procurement practices with the city to get there. It's also understanding that for some businesses, the business model simply does not allow for a living wage, and to say, hey, you know, if you're not able to pay the living wage, let's work together on some of the issues that might be impacting your staff. So partnering it, I think, with the affordable housing strategy is really key. So how can we make sure that we're reducing things for folks like rent? So, you know, that's one of the top expenses of the living wage. Or how can we join together and advocate for childcare solutions in our community that work for families who are struggling to make ends meet? So part of it is saying, here's where we can partner and increase wages, and where we can't, here's where we can take a leadership position and work together to benefit the whole community.
So I want to put the rest of the information on the table, so I'm going to go
Okay.
through that.
Okay.
We'll switch over.
Oh, we're gonna switch, okay.
Okay, so do I just gonna switch.
Thanks, Deanna. Thanks very much for inviting me to be here with Deanna today. And it was interesting listening to Deanna's presentation first and then the questions, so I'm going to abort some of my presentation and hope to focus on some of the questions that came up. And I've been to enough meetings now with both private sector employers and community sector organizations and municipalities. There's similarity of issues that come up and concerns, and I think one of the most important things Deanna said was take your time. Like, don't make decisions quickly. Do them with the fullness of information, with the support of staff, with reports, with thinking through a communication strategy. Don't go to an early yes or an early no, but take your time. Make sure you understand the issue, the opportunity very well, and that it's well supported by the staff, and that the citizens will support. So take your time. This is a poverty reduction strategy, not a bargaining strategy, which is super important to remember when you start talking about working with your unions and looking at positions. Every municipality has a skate supervisor and a swimming pool, and a library shelver, and someone that works at the swimming pool. And the issues are the same municipality to municipality, so you can learn lots by talking to the other municipalities. But the discussion to have with the union and your unionized staff is, this is not a bargaining strategy, this is a poverty reduction strategy. So the first thing, as Deanna said, would be to get a report so that you know the scope of what you're looking at. I would say there's also a great piece of writing and thinking done by Michael Schumann, who's an American economist and living wage activist. And he argues very strongly that the adoption of a local living wage by a municipal government is in fact one of the most important and helpful community economic development strategies. When folks in a community are paid a living wage, when you move people from survival wages to living wages, that money is reinvested in community. People have got money to support local small businesses. They've got money to pay for a haircut. They've got money to go out for pizza once a month, and it is actually a very strong poverty reduction strategy. So why should this is a voluntary campaign. It was voluntary for Vancity, and it's before you as a voluntary opportunity. And what we've heard other municipal leaders say is, why should we do this? You know, in fact, this is a response to failures of public policy, I would say. And people have said, and people may know Mayor Corrigan and Burnaby, who feels quite strongly that it's not the municipal government's role to fill in gaps for federal and provincial public policy failures. That may or may not be true depending on your analysis, but the fact is there are these public policy failures, and it's something that voluntarily we can do as leaders. And maybe to my mind, it would be great if the living wage campaign was a short-term campaign until there was other better public policies. Because of that $20.62 an hour, almost $4 is for the cost of childcare. And almost $1 is for the copay on medical service premiums. So that's $5 of the living wage calculation, which would be solved for if we had better federal and provincial policy support. So we don't have to agree on what we think about public policy or failures of public policy, but understand that's where the costs are, and it is something that we can address. And for the credit union, for my credit union at Squamish Savings, being an early adopter gives us a chance to talk about those public policy failures and ask for better for our communities. So aligned with Deanna's, messages about how to do it, the very most important thing to do is to get your own leadership at council level and at a senior staff level in agreement and on board. And I can tell you, we wasted a ton of time at my credit union wondering how to do this. We spent from 2008, when we first began supporting the campaign as a campaign, until 2011, when our board said we would like to join, because we were terribly afraid of exposing something that wasn't perfect, of sharing with our members, because although, we're, in theory, we're a private company, we're actually a financial cooperative owned by members. In some ways, we're analogous to a municipal government. We have an elected board of directors to whom the staff report. And we were terribly afraid, because we report everything, that people would discover that we had some warts. So we dithered around for 3 years until Tamara, that's our CEO, said, okay, staff, just make it so. And the board said make it so. So we applied to be certified as a living wage employer in 2011, 3 years after we had first forced support. And so I would say it is really important to get stakeholders across the municipality, both support staff at a senior level to start by doing the report and then reporting out in time to council, and then providing the supports for staff to move forward here. It likely looks, because I've talked with both Linda and Christine, given where you're at now, that there needs to be a whole procurement platform and then a resource person to address the living wage issues. This shows, I'm on the left of that photo, and then there's our Senior Vice President of Human Resources and Operations, and then the smiley woman in the middle, in the white coat, is our board chair. So we had folks working at all levels of the organization to make this so. And then, as Deanna said, develop a plan. And our plan, so it took us 3 years to make the application, and then we had a 2-year implementation plan, because as Deanna said, and I know it was fundamentally true, the staff is the easy part, because like us, you will find that 98% of your staff are already paid a living wage, and you've got that skate sharpener and that shelver and someone else that you have to go and talk about with your union. But the combination of base salary and benefits, I am confident you are already at or above a living wage for your own staff. There is a document that I can email to Linda, which she can share with anyone that's interested, that is a little calc for the real return on paying a living wage that looks at some of the outcomes for us of becoming a living wage employer, and some unexpected, there were some benefits that we anticipated, and there were some unexpected benefits that were a complete surprise. But there is actually a business case for doing this, because happy workers do awesome work. And that's what small businesses that have become living wage employers have said, that their churn, their costs of attraction, recruitment, and retention go way down. Although 98% of our staff were already paid a living wage, so only 2% had their wages increased, it was about 50 folks. 100% of our staff feel like this was the most important thing we had done to reinvest in community, and are incredibly proud of working for a living wage employer. Getting leadership on board and providing support looked like this for us at the beginning, because it was the HR people and the finance people were very worried about the costs and worried about, telling the members about paying a living wage. Our CEO said, I'll put aside some money for you to become compliant on our budget, which it's bigger than Squamish by a factor of about 6, I think. She set aside $1 million and said, don't worry about the money now, people. Go and become compliant. It didn't cost us anywhere near that. It cost us $700,000, which is less than 1/4% of our operating budget. So, as you've noted, the costs were very small. That's both our staff and our contracts, and the contracts were where the real work was. So, there's our robust living wage campaigns across the United States and the United Kingdom. The campaigns across Canada are younger, and we don't have the longitudinal evidence in Canada yet. about the cost, but these percentage savings are verified over and over and over from other communities where there are longer term living wage campaigns. 35% increase in performance, 47% improvement in morale, disciplinary issues almost cut in half, improved customer service, and a 50% reduction in employee turnover. So when folks are paid a living wage, they're not considering their next move, they're just happy where they are. And they feel happy about their employer. And they feel more charitable and generous towards their employer. So this is the stepped implementation that Deanna was talking about. The credit union first committed to paying our own employees a living wage rate, which as it turned out was pretty simple to do. And then we committed to pay our key, and this is important, it doesn't say all service suppliers, our key service suppliers. And this was a discussion that we had with the living wage. When we became a living wage employer, we were the largest by a factor of about 100 times employer to come into the campaign. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that because the procurement and piece is actually, it's not complicated, but it's a little bit complex. Okay, so we committed to paying our employees a living wage rate. We were not in bargaining with our union, which was actually where the low paid staff showed up at our call center. We were BCGEU, and so we had a side conversation with BCGEU and put a side agreement to the collective agreement and said, right now we're going to pay employees a top-up because there was no interest on either side in opening the contract. But when we go back into bargaining in 2 years, understand that our new floor will be the living wage for all employees in BCGEU. It was Darryl Walker at the time said, well, that's fine. So it was just kind of a handshake addendum to the contract. Committing to pay our key service suppliers, this was where there was a little more complication, and I've had a couple conversations with Lynn and Christine. Now it's we weren't as organized as you might think we were. We in fact did not have centralized purchasing at the time. We do now as a consequence. And the living wage campaign, and Deanna, it's not Deanna, so she wasn't there then. They said, well, you have to pay all service providers over whom you've got control to provide labor services to you. You got to pay them a living wage. And this is what took us so long. Actually, we went and we were like, oh goodness. We know that we have at least 1,200 suppliers. We can't deal with 1,200 suppliers across 45 different sectors. We're a complex organization. We had everyone from construction workers building new branches to janitors to legal services to architects, like just a whole mishmash of stuff. And frankly, that stopped us dead in our tracks. And we sat around and thought about it. And then someone smartly in finance finally said, look, let's look at where we actually spend the money. And they sorted some information and found that 90% of our spend in contracts was in about 45 or 50 contracts. So that means 10%. So we had 1,200 contracts, and 90% was in about 50 of them. That meant 10% was in 1,150 of them. That meant we had all these unique singular contracts that didn't make any sense to go after. So we went back to the living wage and said, okay, we will do everything that we called it strategic. I don't know why we use that word like that. It just means big. We'll go and look at all the big stuff. And for us, based on, sort of, what do auditors call it? Materiality. For us, that was $250,000. And other employers now have used this threshold, but not at that amount. They've set what is for them an important threshold. I think in a couple of the municipalities it's down to 50 or less. It depends on your size. So what is material for you? So we said, okay, we'll deal with everything we do over 250, except in the spirit of respecting the living wage campaigns, focus on low-wage workers. In 4 categories, we'll take that threshold down. In the categories of janitors, catering, off-site catering when we go to meetings, security services, and temp agencies, in those categories, we'll take that threshold down. So we, resorted. Now we have 52 contracts to deal with. And so that was what we applied to the campaign. That said we would come in and look at these 50-odd contracts, threshold 250, but below for those 4. And I'm happy to share those numbers with staff about what those thresholds were. So as you think about possible implementation or possible cost, think about what makes sense for you. Your threshold might be 50, it might be 40. And maybe there's a few categories of vulnerable, what we call vulnerable workers. Maybe it's like it was for us. security staff and janitorial staff. So to tell a story about ourselves, if you come to Vancouver and come to visit me at Vancity and you go into our head office, the first person you meet is not a Vancity staffer. It's a security person in a Fusion security shirt. Well, after we made this commitment to become a living wage employer and to deal with that contract, and I can tell you, I get more hugs than anyone else at the credit union because I'm the living wage lady. Mike, who's the first person you meet, told me afterwards with tears in his eyes, my wage went up $5 an hour, and now I can look after my mom and my brother who has Down syndrome, and now I can make food choices, and I can take the bus to work. I was like, what? How did we not know that the face of the credit union, the first person you met, was struggling that much? We hadn't asked. We just hadn't asked. And so that really changed Mike's life and how he feels about the credit union. You imagine how positive he feels about representing every day and what he tells other people about how proud he is to work for Vancity. So then, if you have a plan, then implement the plan. What we, am I running out of time, Karen? How am I doing?
Maybe
Blah, blah, blah.
we'll need 10 minutes for questions.
Okay. And what time
I would
are we
like to know
wrapping
how
up?
you got Rick Mercer to clean your office.
I know. I'm going to skip over this slide then. So I told you that we, Tamara set aside $1 million, which for us was it sounds like a lot of money. It wasn't a lot of money on our annual operating budget. It didn't cost that much, but what happened was, well, we had to hire someone. We had disaggregated purchasing, so we had to come up, we hired someone who then brought together purchasing into a purchasing platform, and we now have a full-time dedicated resource who does nothing but work on the living wage, which for sure is an expense. But I would tell you that what's happened is that, and her name is Lisette, and she'd be happy to talk to anyone here. What happened as a result is Lisette took a completely different approach to our RFPs and our procurement policy. And now, instead of just letting an RFP and looking for responses, she has an open house and invites anyone who wants to respond to an RFP in, and she says, here's who we are, here's our vision, mission, and values, here's who we are as a living wage employer, and we're looking for people that want to go on this journey with us. She explains it, and like those first couple of years, we were telling contractors, we are going to pay the difference. We're not looking for you to come up with a living wage to pass on to your employees out of your existing margins. We are going to privilege those contracts where you can demonstrate to us you're going to pay the living wage. It's not going to come straight out of decreased margins for you, but we will pay more. That's what the $1 million was for. So Lisette has these open houses, then she puts out the RFP. Half of the folks walk away and say, we're not interested, it doesn't work for our cost structure, it's too complicated, we won't respond. The other half that do respond are like, we're in it, we want to do this. We see this as a differentiator, we want to be a living wage employer. Because all these things happened at the same time with now Lisette and this purchasing department, I can tell you, and this is the unintended consequence I don't often like to tell people, is actually we're now saving money. Because it's cleaned up a whole bunch of our contracting, our purchasing. Because we've been packing stuff on and people have been selling us and we weren't looking at contracting very carefully. And now instead of negotiating across the table, sharpening our pencils with our suppliers, we're sitting side by side looking at what we need and what they can offer. And that first, it cost us $700,000 that first year, we saved $2 million the next year. Because the suppliers started unbundling stuff and saying, actually, you don't need 500 of that thing, or actually, you don't need 500 hours, we can do this with this many hours. And so it, while it was never our intention that this actually be a cost-saving measure, surprise, surprise, it has become a cost-saving measure, and we now have centralized purchasing, and we have a completely different relationship with our suppliers, about which we feel quite proud and pleased. And it's definitely a journey. It's not once and done. We figured out those strategic suppliers and who we wouldn't want to deal with in that 2011. 6 years out, every year we discover something else we should consider bringing into the living wage family. So right now, Lisette is working on pre-qualifying some off-site meeting spaces, so we've got more choices about meeting spaces. So Lisette is not gone. She's an ongoing addition to our crew. But we think a very, very useful one, and we're very proud to have made that long-term commitment. And there are folks around to help. Of course, Deanna talked about the city of Putnam, New Westminster, the earliest one in. We also have this roadmap for large employers, which was actually too big to mail because marketing helped. So it's full of images. But if you go to our website, you can download it from there. And then finally, this is Locals BC graphic, and it supports the Michael Schuman's assertion that investing in small businesses reinvests in the local economy. So that when you buy from small local business, every $100, 46 stays in the local economy, and that the living wage strategy to have workers to have the room to breathe and make local purchasing decisions are in fact the best community economic development strategy, and also have the effect of both not only supporting small businesses, but guarding against the influx of big box and other sort of companies that would not build good, durable local jobs. So I totally get what your challenges are, Susan, but it is shown that it is, and you were nodding your head when I said Michael Schuman, his work and what a great advocate he is, and that's it.
Thank you. Okay, so I imagine there's a few more questions. Ted, I think you have all of one, is that right? And then I've got
Yeah,
Susan.
well, I a lot more information now, but I was asking about the procurement costs, that you answered that one there. And, yeah, so I'll just wait a minute.
All right. Susan, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Michael, I studied community economic development. He came up and taught at SFU, so
Right.
I studied under Michael Schuman, and he is a fantastic advocate for small business. And to Michael Schuman's work, I just worry that we have limited resources in our municipality because of our financial situation and because we only have one economic development officer. And I completely agree with you that living wages are so important. But I also believe that our resources, when they're so spread thin and we only have one economic development officer, that our resources should be put into making living wages for the community. And following our business retention expansion plan to support local businesses needs to be number one. And to stop spreading our resources thin, looking outside for work, and really helping our community expand and grow, and spending our resources making sure that our community has local economic development and wages that are appropriate to spend in the community, and as all the information that, because of everything that you guys have both said, and that our municipality where wages are up over $100,000, where we are encouraging tourism and we don't have industry anymore except for tourism that pays not a living wage, 12 bucks an hour, and that we're supporting mostly coffee shop development, and we don't have a lot of actual industry in our town. Now we have one economic development officer. I wonder about actually spending our time and resources working on the plans that we have in place and resourcing our economic development officer appropriately so that our businesses have a place to be able to expand and grow in our community, as opposed to spending that minutia time to make sure that, like, our procurement is for pavement and people that do get paid living wages in our municipality. Yes, maybe there's an adjustment here and there where our cleaners aren't making exactly the right amount, and we can definitely look at that, and I think that's worthwhile as well. But to spend time and resources developing a plan so that we can say living wage when everybody knows that our wages are well over everybody else's wages in the whole community right now, and that our community is sincerely struggling, and we have to tax for the resources to do a plan. Yeah, we have to tax for the resources to do a plan. What is the value of actually doing this for the municipality before we do things for local businesses? Before we actually have done a plan, before we have economic development in place to help our local businesses? Where is the value for our community in doing it for the district first? I know it's a lot, but that's exactly Michael Schuman's point, is that you have to help your local businesses before you help everybody else.
Well, I'm not entirely sure that is a question. I mean, I think showing leadership and then encouraging other businesses as they can to pay a living wage is an important leadership step for municipal government. I know the community of Revelstoke, which is in some ways analogous to you, has been involved in a couple-year research project with BBC Okanagan to look at, they're actually quite ambitious. They're talking about making all of Revelstoke, not the district of Revelstoke, but all of Revelstoke a living wage community. And they've done some very sophisticated analysis on the margins around food and beverage and service industries and how little it would take, actually, how little it would take for some of the most egregiously poorly paid businesses in that community to come up to a living wage. So that may be another resource that you want to reach out to, the Economic Development Officer in Revelstoke. But you know, I think it's important for all kinds of reasons, and I would encourage you to start with a plan before you make a decision that it's not worth doing.
And I think, just to build on what Catherine's saying, the whole point of the conversation today is actually to not make any assumptions about what is going on in Squamish and what's possible or not possible. But actually, a lot of the communities that I've listened to talk about their living wage strategy is about creativity and working with the community and finding the partners in the community that they want to work with. And so I think, for me, this is the start of the conversation, and as you say, the start of a journey. But I think, at least the ones that I've listened to, have all approached it slightly differently. And very much a sense of partnership and a sense of innovation in mind. And so I'm excited to hear about Revelstoke, and that's another one that I'm going to look at. I'm going to go to Jason, and then I'm going to open up the floor to anybody in the audience before we wrap up.
Yeah, not really a question because you're preaching to the converted over here, but more of a comment and to say that I think definitely in our community inequality has increased substantially over the last decade, and I think it's time that we actually take a look at this. And on the one hand, there's also new opportunities because I think that there are a class of consumer in Squamish that can afford to spend extra for the meals and other things like that. But it's about getting the information out there because quite often small businesses and other kinds of organizations don't have the time or the capacity to actually do all these calculations and see that. So I think that us taking the leadership as a district to get that information out there and show how it's done and sort of be the pilot for it is actually very valuable for the community.
There is a resource,
Go ahead.
a book written a couple of years ago called The Spirit Level, which looked at the growing inequality in a number of countries around the world and what happens in any a local economy when the gap between the most well-off and the least well-off becomes greater, and the terrible consequences that has. Even if everyone is relatively highly paid, if this gap is huge here, you have all these downstream consequences of crime and educational outcomes being poor for folks and people's sense of isolation and exclusion. And that's what Deanna was also talking about at the beginning of her slide. When folks aren't paid a living wage and they have to job stack at minimum wage jobs, and they're working 70, 80, 90 hours a week, what happens in a community? Who's looking after the kids? Who's reading the homework? Who's coaching the soccer team? Who's got time to go to their temple or their place of worship? Who's reading the newspaper? Who has time to show up at counseling meetings and talk with counselors about what's important? There are all these terrible downstream consequences in an unequal society when the people that have the worst wages can't participate. They're effectively denied citizenship. And who wants to say that about our neighbors? Who can feel great about saying that about our neighbors?
Thank you. So sorry, I want to make sure we have time. If there's anyone in the audience that wants to ask a question at this point, and that includes staff, because some of our other staff are here, so just raise your hand, come to the table if you've got a question. Okay, go ahead. Come to the table, Catherine.
Sure. Hi, Catherine Rockadell, 2538. My question is, I thought it was very interesting what you were talking about there, and I wondered if there's any cases of hospitals or healthcare authorities actually buying into the living wage or implementing it within hospitals, not so much for doctors and nurses who are better paid, but I'm thinking more for support workers and people like that. And I didn't hear any example there, and I'm just wondering in British Columbia or across Canada if there's anything that's an example like that.
Yeah, so we haven't had a lot of pickup from from hospitals or in BC, and I think that may shift. We're, I think, walking into a new policy environment with a different government, and we'll see what happens as a result of that. But we do have a long-term care, a group of long-term care homes that are living wage employers, and that's really exciting because you also have there, a lot of folks doing really important care work, and we like to see that paid at a living wage rate. There's multiple levels of social exclusion that happens in long-term care, and so that's really exciting. In Ontario, I think, do they have? I don't think they have. We have a school district in Ontario, but I think that health has actually not picked up on it for a number of reasons. I think in Ontario, part of it is that convoluted procurement processes, especially with the contracting out of support work that's happening, and so bringing that in is challenging. So we unfortunately haven't had to pick up. My mom is a support worker, so my mom does laundry in a hospital.
Well, there's a lot, as Susan knows, there's a lot of people in Squamish and in the Sea to Sky corridor who are working in aspects of the healthcare field. And so, as I was listening to your presentation, the municipality, as we've heard, many of them they don't have a problem with most of the people being paid. But in healthcare, there's a lot of people that are working in aspects of healthcare that I know in my community are not making living wages and really struggle, and they have families. Not that I do, but I know they do, and so it's certainly something I'm concerned about. And there are also large institutions and organizations with similar types of bureaucracy as perhaps a local government would have, and so looking at how perhaps if the government is doing planning, that they look at engaging those organizations in this conversation, so that because there's lots of implications, as Doug in his questions has mentioned, there's implications for the economic side of it. But anyway, that was my question. So there really isn't a lot of cases. There's a couple. Maybe we could show leadership here. That's the only thing I can say. I'm gonna sit down.
Any other questions? Hang up, please.
Not so much a question, but maybe the second part. I'm Lois Wynn. I'm with Sea to Sky Community Services.
Great.
And I just want to say we are technically a supplier for the district, so I welcome any conversations around procurement. No, I think it's great because we do some smaller scale ourselves, so it's got my wheels turning. And I guess the other part of it is we are a unionized nonprofit in town. We're one of the larger employers, and so I'm very interested around living wage issue for some of our positions, and bargaining comes up in 2019. So anything that the council does here that can help influence that process, we're sort of an interesting process around bargaining because we have a employers association. There's 220 agencies, and then a large union committee, and we rely on government approving any of those wage increases that happen. So we're based on contracts. So whatever happens here that can help influence a new government coming up in the next couple of years will be very welcome. And happy to provide any information on wages or help participate in any additional conversation. Yeah, thank you guys. That's
Thank
great.
you.
All right, any last questions from the community? I'm already cutting into Patty's committee of the whole, so.
We eliminate the council.
Yeah, I see council's hands on, looking at the community. Okay, if you do have any more questions, put your hand up. So I've got Ted, Susan, and Doug.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, sorry. Patty,
So
Ted,
easily forgotten.
Susan, Doug.
Oh, I was first.
Pat, no, she had her hand up before.
Yeah.
Patty, Ted, Susan, Doug, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to, our economic development is fundamentally, foundationally business retention, like it's 90%. And I think it's an important piece in this whole discussion for sure. One thing that's interesting about Squamish, and this talks to the disparity that Jason was talking about, we have a very high household income. So people think everyone's doing great. Our household income is over $100,000 per house. I mean, Metro Van is only 70, Whistler's 68, and we're at 103 or something like that. It's huge, but that doesn't mean everybody is enjoying that. There is a significant, as your statistics point out, amount of poverty in our community, like in every community. So I think really it's about leadership. I was actually going to put forward a motion that we request staff to report on the implications and possible impacts of adopting a living wage policy, as was suggested. I think that's just a first step, so we know what we're talking about. We have the baseline numbers. I think a lot of that, so it's been seconded?
Yes, I was going to say, is that the motion you're putting forward?
That is.
Okay, so then seconded by Jason. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I realize Mr. Sim is not here, and he obviously is going to need to watch this. He's our HR manager. We need to watch this. But I'm hoping it's, not a massive amount of work. We do some analysis, we bring back some numbers so we know exactly what we're talking about. And in the meantime, we do a bit more research and appreciation, understanding of those value-added benefits that you talk about, those sort of unintended consequences that are positive, maybe negative too. We need to get the whole picture in front of us. I think, anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So I'll call the question on the motion on the table. All those.
Unless there's some more comments on that.
Oh, okay.
She's trying to be efficient because she's in there.
I'm trying to be efficient. Well, you guys, your hands were all up before the motion was on the floor. So I figured your questions were not related to the motion, which is why I was proceeding to vote on the motion. So if everyone's comfortable with the motion on the table, can I proceed to that and then go to the questions?
So I'd like to ask questions about the motion on the table.
Okay. So I'm going to go to Susan, then I will come back to you after we vote on the motion.
So I'm just, I think there's value in calculating what our living wage is, and specifically, just like starting off with calculating what our living wage is, and I'm not sure if that is included in the scope, or is the scope going to come back and say, we need to calculate what our living wage is? Because I think the most important thing is figuring out what a living wage is before we go down the path of.
So that was implicit in the motion, because we can't get implications and impacts without knowing the number.
Exactly.
It's
It's
not
implicit, or
correct.
can we
Our
actually?
first report would require us to do that work and calculate the living wage.
Yeah, okay.
And
Absolutely,
I can
that's-
provide support. I can't calculate it, but I can
No, but
provide
I
support.
We have to be evaluating the implications and impacts based on something, right? So yes,
Right.
we would have to know what it is here.
But it's not going to come back as
And
a
it'll likely
report saying,
between 17
we have to calculate the
and
implications.
And a half-ish.
Right. Okay, excellent, thank you.
Any other questions about the motion specifically on the table? All right, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Now I'm going to go ahead.
Thanks.
Susan Dunphy.
Well, Patty answered, and Susan answered one of my questions there about our living wage in Squamish. I'm sure is higher than $35,000. We'll find that out. But one thing you said that I thought was interesting is when you started studying your procurement policies, the second year you saved $2 million. So I thought, I wonder, do we have a procurement person on staff checking on ours? Because that might have nothing to do with living wage, that just might have to do, and so that I thought was
Okay, I'll
really
let Christine
interesting.
answer that question.
Thank you, Chair. We don't right now. We did a preliminary business case last year to request that an agent be added. It was not put forward last year because we had other higher priorities, but we are looking at it again for the very reasons you're talking about, in terms of making our purchasing more efficient and saving costs and pulling some administrative services for our department heads.
Thank you.
And so when you go for a living wage, do you look at a couple both working and you add up their incomes combined?
Yeah, so it's two parents working fully or full-time, yeah.
I mean, I certainly sympathize with people stressed making little amount of money. And I can just feel the pain. So, I mean, I support her for that. I also hear Susan loud and clear with economic development. I know lots of young people that start businesses and get going, and lo and behold, they're doing pretty good. So, the economic development part is really important.
Thanks, Ted. All right.
Oh, last thing, the $10 daycare, that's the one that I think would really help.
Yeah.
$10 a day daycare, that would be a priority for me.
And
Yeah.
I think this speaks to what Deanna was saying earlier about that we have to partner where we can and advocate where we can. It's not just about the living wage, it's also about housing and it's about childcare. And those are huge factors in the cost of living for people. So clearly Susan, that
Thanks, and yeah, I think that it's just economics of a district is so complicated and so overwhelming, I think, for trying to deal with equity issues. And this work is fantastic, and I totally support living wage, but I just always wonder where the best bang for the buck is, and when you start getting into municipalities versus communicating to the public, which I think is incredibly valuable, and us using our resources to calculate what the living wage is and what we expect from people in our district, like when they move here and having a policy in place. I agree with Karen that the communication and partnership is key. On the piece of daycare, and those are little bits, and we've done a ton of policy work to encourage everything we can possibly do at our district level for daycare. We encourage space, but it's up to the province now. You can have a daycare in every single house and spot in Squamish now. But finding daycare workers requires that we pay them a living wage, which we don't. So that key piece of providing daycare workers with a living wage, and I was talking with somebody about this just yesterday, and they were mentioning that what would it look like if daycare workers were actually teachers? Because they are seeing our kids and they're spending the same amount of time with our kids, and they were put into the teachers union, which guaranteed them a living wage, and that they were treated the same way as teachers were treated. And I thought, and that was from a union worker who I thought was, how do we make sure our daycare workers are paid a living wage so that we can have daycare workers? Because right now, it's not economically viable for women to work in daycare. It's not that we don't have the spots or the space. It's we don't have the workers. We don't have educated workers. It's prohibitive. So it's a lot of little bits. How do we gather? In the strategy, would it be
This is the beginning
gathering?
of the conversation.
Yeah.
And we have a committee meeting we have to go into, just to
Right.
remind.
There we go.
Yeah, it's seeing those intersections, right? So, and I think that the living wage provides a way to communicate those intersections. So for example, the $10 a day daycare plan, which includes a living wage for daycare workers, will reduce the living wage in Metro Vancouver by $4.12 an hour. So how do we communicate these intersections of policy in a way that is accessible for our community? Because often the policy advocacy that we do it's important, it's vital, but often it doesn't allow people an easy entry. And so the living wage is one way, and obviously I have a bit of an opinion on this one, but it's one way to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief. I'd originally put my hand up to see where this was going, and the mayor's motion answered that question. But just a comment, I tend to agree. I think the role of municipality, although financially for our budget there's probably very little impact, but I think it's very important for us to take a leadership position and to set an example. And I think a lot of the effect of this is peer pressure. Once it gets out into the community and one business starts paying it and another business then kind of has to bring themselves up to that standard. So there can be that ripple effect. We will have some control over our suppliers. We're not like Vancity, we don't have 1,200 of them, I don't think, but we do have some.
There's a lot more businesses than Vancity.
We will have some. And I get the point about the effect on small business and so forth, except that going back to your statement, this is about poverty reduction. And so, yes, we want to encourage the business community, of course, but we don't necessarily want to put aside poverty reduction until we do that. I think the two can carry on together. So every reason to start going with this right now.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Talking about the poverty reduction, and I think one of the things you said earlier about how it trickles down to the kids at the end of the day, because that's really sort of the final distillation. And we had our early childhood development study come through, and we see where that really impacts the kids, the ability for the parents to take them to extracurricular sports, be able to spend time doing homework, to provide them even with a decent lunch at school. And so I think at the end of the day, this all comes really down on the kids, and that's important.
I just want
No.
I want to thank you both for coming and helping us start this conversation. I think it's timely. I think it is connected to so many things that our council has been trying piece, it's not the solution, none of those things are the solution, but together they represent policy impacts we can have. And it just is a reminder to me that they're all connected, and when we are advocating to our new government, how important it is to be advocating on multiple fronts, and not just one. So thank you for the input that you've provided and for answering our questions. And I just wanted to go to Linda, maybe, I know we've passed a motion on the fly.
Yep.
And just in terms of timing of when this report could come back to council, given the other priorities on that.
Thank you, Chair. It's timely in the sense that we're bringing the strategic plan list back to council next week in terms of prioritizing projects. I can't speak to the timing of that. I would have to talk to staff. I know when we met with Catherine and Jeff Sim, our senior director, and Christine, we don't have any capacity right now. So it would be a matter of moving something out, and I can't answer what that is right now. If council tells us that this is a priority based on this motion, then I need to go back and figure out what that looks like, and then I can tell you how long.
So we'll have a conversation about it next week.
Next week, of course.
All right, excellent. Thank you again for the resources, the ideas, the conversation. We don't have any recommendations or referrals from council, and we're late, so we're not going to have a roundtable discussion on the motion to terminate. Moved by Patty, seconded by Jason. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much.